Hi, everyone. My name is Alexandra Quill with Macmillan Publishers, and today I am so thrilled to introduce you to our next incredible speaker, Wayétu Moore. Wayétu Moore is the founder of One More Book, a nonprofit organization that distributes culturally relevant books for underrepresented readers. A graduate of Howard University, Columbia University, and the University of Southern California, she is the author of a novel, She Would Be King, and a memoir, The Dragons, the Giant, the Women, which was a 2020 New York Times notable book. Wayétu is due to give birth this week, so she couldn't join us live today, but she recorded a video address for this event. She discusses her memoir, which details her experiences growing up in Liberia amidst the outbreak of the Liberian Civil War, resettling in the United States in a conservative Texas suburb where she first encountered the realities of racism, navigating her identity as an immigrant and a young Black woman, and searching for home in the midst of a people. Please join me in watching this address from Wayétu Moore.
Hi everyone, my name is Wayétu Moore and I am the author of The Dragons, the Giant, the Women. I was born in Monrovia, Liberia, and when I was 5 years old, the Civil War broke out in the country. My mother at the time, she was studying in New York on a Fulbright scholarship at Columbia University, and my father and my two sisters and I lived in Monrovia in a suburb called Caldwell, with my grandmother and a couple of other caretakers. When the war broke out, we had to escape our home and we headed to my maternal grandmother's village to hide. And we were on the road for about 2 weeks or so before making it to the village. And during that time, there were some really horrendous things that we were exposed to as children. There were dead bodies on the road. There were people walking around, rebels walking around with guns. And what my father and grandmother did to preserve our childhood was to create a rather fantastic view of our experience. Dead bodies on the road were actually people sleeping, and the gunshots we heard, they told us, were drums being played in the distance. When we did make it to the village, there were other things that happened that, of course, shattered the perspective that we would be safe for much longer. And then I just became a little girl who desperately wanted to see her mother. America at the time was a mythology. America was the world's Emerald City. But growing up in Liberia before the war, there was a magic that existed there too. There was a sense of normalcy. And it was important to me while I was writing to feature the reality of many people's lived experience as not being one of tragedy and one of poverty, but one of a middle-class suburban life that you would see in any country. But even though people were looking onward to America as being an answer to the nightmare that they found themselves in, and there was beauty that existed in Liberia before the war as well. When my mother was in New York, at a certain point, she was unable to reach us. She tried calling, and this is the time before cell phones, of course, and she couldn't reach us. And of course, letters weren't going through. And because the news cycle in America was delayed, she wasn't really hearing anything on the national news about the war and what was unfolding in Liberia. The way that she got information is by people who had made it over, who had been able to fly over successfully to the United States or to other countries and then contact her. While we were actually walking during the 3 weeks that I mentioned, my dad saw someone who used to work for him being held on the ground at gunpoint by a rebel soldier. And he gave the rebel the last money that he had. So he ended up escaping to Ghana, and he wanted to repay my dad. And so he started calling Liberians in America, trying to get in touch with my mother, and finally was able to reach her and tell her exactly where we were. And so all of a sudden, Now, some of her anxieties were quelled because she knew that we were alive and she knew where we were hiding. So my mom was able to raise money. She borrowed money. She spoke to her advisors at Columbia and said, hey, I'm going to go back to this country and I'm going to try to get my family out. And so, of course, they had tried to advise her against it. Said, well, if you stay too long, you lose your scholarship and you have nothing. You could get killed. The borders are closed. How are you going to get through? And she just has always had an unrelenting faith, so decided that she was going to go anyway. And while at the border, she met a man who introduced her to this network of women, rebel soldiers, who, as a way of reconciling with some of the atrocities that they had to commit, created a network where they were trafficking people's families across the border. So my mother paid a rebel soldier to go into the village and get us out and traffic us across the border. We were in Sierra Leone, in Freetown, where my mother was staying, for about a month, and then we immigrated to the United States. When we moved to America, we all shared my mother's dorm room with her. That's my father, my two sisters, myself, my mother, my younger brother, who my mom had given birth to in the time that she had been away from us, my aunt, and a cousin. And after that time, my aunt and cousin moved to Maryland, and my family, we moved around quite a bit, actually. We lived in Connecticut for about a year. We lived in Memphis for 2 years, and we settled in Texas, in a suburb of Houston, Texas, when I was 8 years old. Early assimilation stories are featured in the memoir as well. One, most notably, was our first Halloween. My parents are Christian and fundamentally so, and so we didn't celebrate Halloween. And so our first encounter with it, I went to school and saw everyone dressed up in a number of different costumes. Some were dressed up as honeybees and some were dressed up as princesses, and yes, some were dressed up as devils and creatures that you would only see in your nightmares. And my parents coincidentally only saw the devils of the creatures you see in their nightmares, and they didn't want us to have any parts of it. I knew at a very early age that I was different, that my family was different. I sensed that we were foreign. I did. When we moved to Texas, we moved to a very white suburban town called Spring. And we were one of a handful of Black families. And in Texas, I was considered Black. That's it. The Black family took us into the Black community there. And a lot of what I learned about American racism was through them, because my parents really came here with immigrant sensibilities of telling us things like, you could do anything here that you want to do, make the most of it. And I was not indoctrinated with the idea that there were things that I wouldn't be able to do because I was a Black woman. Earliest encounters with racism was going to a corner store with some friends after track practice in middle school and being called the N-word and having to run from a corner store after being called that slur, and understanding then that there's no country that is perfect, that mythology of America as the world's emerald city could be shattered, and there were things that were imperfect about it as well, even though it did in many ways coexist with the reality that my family was able to flourish here and make a new beginning here. And I think it's that duality that adds to the complexity of the experience of many young immigrants, especially young Black immigrants, because you come here with those sensibilities of America as the land of opportunity. And so sometimes it can be tough. I mean, because if it's something that if that isn't your inheritance and something that you're raised hearing, that you have to be careful, don't talk back to cops, there are things that you don't do in this country just because of the way that it's set up institutionally. That isn't something that I heard at home growing up. My parents never told me that I had to work twice as hard to get anywhere. They just told me to be great. at whatever it was that I was attempting to do. But I did learn over the years. It's about the microaggressions. It's about the things that you do begin to wonder. It's about having friends who are Black and brown people who do have that inheritance and who could tell you, oh no, girl, that happened because you were Black. And so those were things that were very valuable to me, but it can be initially an incredibly shocking experience. It can be very shocking. Dad is someone who I would call a Pan-Africanist, and so I was raised hearing just as much about Thomas Sankara and Kwame Nkrumah and African leaders as I was about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Frederick Douglass and African American leaders. The way that my father explained my history to me and my identity to me was that I'm a Black body in this world, and that holds a lot of power and that holds a lot of promise. My indoctrination never included the limitations of my skin color. That is what began in understanding how people thought about me because of the color of my skin, and understanding the world's expectations of me because of my race. That's what really triggered my explorations in identity. At home with my parents, you would ask them, do you think your daughter could win the Nobel Prize in, I don't know, biochemistry? And they would say, oh yes, she can. That's the kind of encouragement I had at home. They wouldn't say, oh, well, I haven't seen any Black people do that. But then outside of my home, it was very different. When I I considered myself African American because that's the community I was raised with. But when I moved to New York, I attended NYU for a couple of years for theater. Would meet people, or there was a African American club or Black student union, and I was the president of the Black student union in high school. And so I went to the Black student union meeting at school, and people said, oh, hi, how are you? Have you checked out the African student union yet? And then I of course, went to the African student union meeting, and they said, oh, but you're American, you were raised here. And so I would start reading books on something called third culture kids and being cross-cultural, and how that in effect is its own identity. It's third culture, being in the middle of both homes and not fully feeling accepted or at home in either one. And the way that I made peace with my identity, and it's an ongoing process, I still have that internal monologue of, okay, well, where do I fit in occasionally? Well, there is real value in being able to stretch across cultures and across homes and places, being able to relate to so many different people. That's a strength that I did not recognize until I was much older. And the advice that I would give to anyone who is dealing with issues of identity and belonging, especially those who are fellow cross-cultural or third cultural students, is to remember that it's okay if your home is in the middle. I think it's important for people to write and immortalize their stories, especially people with identities and from places that don't normally get featured in stories or in books, because we are at a point now where we are creating the history that will be read in 200, 300 years. And for so long, being from a place like Liberia, I got used to hearing and reading people who were not Liberians telling our story. And so it has been very empowering to be able to explore the art that I love and marry that with my story. Fiction, you're dealing with abstract thoughts and themes like friendship and revolution and home and love and family, and you're trying to concretize those themes through story. And with memoir, you have a story, you have something that's set, that happened, and you're trying to create abstractions from that very concrete through line. And what I try to do, and what I would encourage you to do, is approach it as fiction. You go first think about what have been the recurring themes in my life. What have been things that continue to come up? Is it family? Is it motherhood? Is it I guess on the more ominous side, abandonment? Is it anxiety? And you look at those themes, and then you go from there and begin to consider the stories and the examples that you've had in your life that could help you to expand on those themes. And we can all relate to both the triumphant themes and the ominous themes in our experiences.